Thank you. So, welcome to our fourth meeting, and wonderful to see so many of you here, an audience of 320, on the next chapter in our approach to sustainability, which, as I'm sure everyone's worked out, they've been coming for some time, is one of the major themes that permeates Keele World Affairs programme, because it is the big global issue. And we look at, if I said in the email to you all, if you go on our website and have a look and just type in climate or sustain, you'll find no fewer than 25 or even more meetings that we've had in the last 10 years. Everyone different. And I assure you that tonight is going to be different as well. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Rebecca Willis to us. And you've seen her CV. I'm not going to go through that. I would just mention that she's associated very much with understanding the citizen and what the public think about climate change, and she interacts with government on various committees. And I think that will emerge in the course of her talk, which is a fairly close parallel with one of her recent books, which is Too Hot to Handle, The Democratic Challenge of Climate Change. And as I said 2 meetings ago, it's got many virtues, one of which is that it's very short. And it appeals to busy people like us who want to get into these important subjects, but not have to wade through 750 pages. So I would commend that to you, and Becky will be at the Nantwich book desk at the interval, and she'll be delighted to see you. And so that's all I wanted to say, because I think this subject is too hot to handle, so I'm going to pass it to Professor Rebecca Willis.
Very good. Thank you, Bill. It's lovely to be here. I know Keele well. I collaborate with Keele academics. Brilliant to see you all. Particularly appreciate you seeing a full front row, because you never get that when students, when you're teaching students. You never get it at comedy gigs either, because I think the worry is that we'll ask for volunteers. So if I could have a volunteer, please. No. Don't worry, front row, you're safe. So I lead the Climate Citizens Research Group at Lancaster, and we look at the intersection between democracy and climate change. And we do every aspect of that, from kind of deep conceptual dives into the theory of democracy, which I won't be talking about, through to very, very practical, applied interrogations into how democracy and climate change link. And the photo that you see here is from a citizens panel that we ran with the Climate Change Committee, who are the government's independent statutory advisors on climate change. And it was the first time that the committee had done anything like this. We brought together this group of people who are representative of the UK as a whole, and I'll talk a bit more about this sort of process. And we asked them to answer the question, what needs to happen to bring home energy use in line with the need to tackle climate change? And that's the question that they're holding up in that banner there. And what we do through these processes is really deepen democracy. That's what we try and do, and I'll unpack that over the course of this evening. So I've thought and written about this for a long time, but this year particularly, it really concentrates the mind, because 4 billion people are going to the polls this year. Most have happened already. Obviously, in a few weeks, days, we have maybe the most significant election coming up. But those 4 billion include the 3 largest democracies, the US, obviously, India, and Indonesia. And so a year like this really concentrates the mind about how we tackle these twin challenges of democratic engagement and the climate crisis. What does it mean for the climate when all those people go to the polls to cast their votes? So I know that an audience like this will be very familiar with the climate challenge, but no matter how familiar my audience, I find it really important just for a moment to reflect on the state we're in. The steep upward line is our current warming rate, observed warming in the blue line. The dotted line is what we expect to continue because of the inertia in the system, and we need to hit that green area. We need to be in the middle of that band for a decent chance of getting to what is a politically, not scientifically agreed safe limit of 1.5. That was the agreement made in Paris in 2015. So we have to flatten that curve. There's no sign yet of decline. And to summarize how well we're doing, I would say we've absolutely smashed the target setting. We're really good at setting targets, but no state, democratic or otherwise, yet has a plan that is credibly consistent with that 1.5 degree temperature increase. Now, this is a global problem. It's important to give the planetary perspective. This is age of the planet, 1,000 years before, thousands of years before the present. And you'll see that, obviously, the Earth's temperature has changed a lot over time. The arrows here point to some really significant moments for us as a species. From when the first migration of modern humans came out of Africa, that's the first arrow, through to migrations into Europe. But the thing that I really want you to look at is that little bit there, the circle called the Holocene, and where it's marked the beginning of agriculture. So roughly 10,000 years ago, agriculture began, and during that time, as you'll see from this graph, we've seen the most remarkable climatic stability in the period that is known as the Holocene. So that is all that modern civilization of the kind that we would recognize as human civilization has ever known. And the agriculture point is significant because the point of agriculture is that it allows you to concentrate food provision in smaller areas, because rather than hunting and gathering, looking where you can bring food to people rather than sending people to look for food. Effectively means you can gather in larger groups. You can create villages, towns, cities. And once you have lots of people living together, you have to talk about how to organize yourselves, and that is the foundation of democracy, one of the ways in which people can organize themselves as a society, as a collective. But the thing that we really need to reflect on is that we've only ever done democracy in periods of climatic stability. So we don't actually know whether we'll be able to continue this form of organisation in a period of climatic instability. Because we know that climate impacts are things like extreme weather events, floods and heat waves. We know that they have an impact on the food system, coming back to agriculture. But the thing that has been surprisingly little researched is the indirect effects on political stability and geopolitical risks. So if you look at the UK's climate impacts report, there's endless amounts about flooding, which of course there should be. I live in Cumbria, we've had a lot of floods, I know what that feels like. But there's very little about geopolitical risks due to disruption of food chains, for example. But as this graph shows all too clearly, we need to think about heading for that uncharted territory. So that's the state we're in. I'd like to bring you down a bit. But being a scholar of democracy, I'm going to follow that with some good news, which is that actually, as a global society, we're up for this challenge. And it's actually very surprising how consistent the research findings are on the levels of concern about climate and support for action. So this is some work from the Pew Research Center in the US. You'll see that 3 out of 4 across 19 countries view global climate change as a major threat. More than threats to the global economy or infectious disease, even after a pandemic. Okay, we're worried about climate. Does that mean we're prepared to get behind the things that we need to do to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases? Well, actually, yes. And these are figures from the UK. I could have picked figures from elsewhere in the world. The situation's a little bit different in the US, which we could get onto in questions, maybe. The interesting thing about that from the point of view of a researcher is that loads of the scholarship, particularly around politics and climate change, has been done out of the US, and there's this feeling that it just gets imported out of actually what is a particular politically very specific context. So I think we've suffered a bit from that form of US import because it just doesn't hold in Europe, and I can talk a bit more about that. But these are figures for the UK. Levels of support for wind farms, seen by politicians as very controversial, are actually remarkably high. About 70% of us think they're fine. Even something which is seen to be like the ultimately controversial, like restrictions on flying, this idea of a frequent flyer levy, the more flights you take, the more tax you pay, gets about sort of 60% support and only 20% actual opposition. So even on something like that, those are pretty good numbers from a pollster's perspective. Those are just polls. Because I do qualitative, deliberative research, I don't actually like polling data, but it's useful for numbers. We can dig into that a bit, but the quote that you see here is actually from the foreword to Climate Assembly UK, which I'll say a bit more about later, but it was 100 people who were selected to represent their country, and they were demographically representative of the UK. This was a process done for the UK Parliament. I was one of the expert leads for that process. And we asked the Assembly members to write their own foreword to their report. And what they wanted to say was that this is a job for government. They want government leadership, but they also understand that all of us will have to play our part. And they spoke quite eloquently about how this was a sort of conversation between people and government. Both sides had a role to play. And this support is generally very poorly recognised by politicians. So we've done a lot of interviews with politicians, and there's also some polling data which shows that politicians actually misunderstand where the public are on climate. They underestimate the level of public support for climate. The phrase that I hear a lot, particularly from political leaders, is that we need to take the public with us, implying that it's the people who need convincing. But the reality is probably the opposite. It's the people who need to take the politicians with them. So why haven't we really leaned into this support? Why haven't we made a better fist of climate politics? So I think the answer to this question needs a bit of unpacking. So I'm going to do that by talking you through a research process that we started back in 2021. It was in the run-up to the big climate summit, COP26 at Glasgow, and we brought together a panel of 40 people who, again, were broadly representative of the public as a whole. And we worked with them over a relatively long time, over a 6-month period, and we got them to do a lot of exercises like designing an eco-friendly company and writing a political party manifesto. We found lots of different ways to try and unpack their attitudes about climate issues. And we were particularly interested in what they saw as the role for government. And the findings on this point were absolutely fascinating, because they saw a key role for government. They wanted leadership from government. But then actually, when they talked about what they thought might happen and what they would do, there was a lot of contradictions. So, for example, when they were coming up with a business plan for an eco-friendly company, they went incredibly micro. One group even wanted to set up a horse and cart delivery service for local vegetables. Now, I think that sounds fantastic. But no one said, no one said, let's regulate the international food system. They were, delivering vegetables by horse and cart. And it was this kind of retreat into a micro space, into a very personal space that we found really fascinating. There was a lot that was very community-focused, very small scale, and nothing confronting that systemic challenge that they themselves said was needed. So, as researchers, we sat back and said, well, what's going on here? Why this contradiction? And my colleagues in my team did an absolute deep dive into the literature, into the transcripts, and they coded the transcripts and tried to look for patterns, and this is what they found out. And we called what's happening as a sort of retreat from climate citizenship. So at the start of the process, we were at midday there, 12 o'clock. Through this process, we gave them a greater understanding of the climate crisis. They spoke to scientists. They considered it, because they were part of this process, in a much more systematic way than we all do sort of when going about our everyday lives. They were sort of forced to focus on it, really. And as a result, like those slides I just showed you, it's no surprise to say that their concern about climate increased. So there was already quite a lot of awareness about climate, but the focus on it led to greater concern. And as a result of that, they saw the need, they saw the need for government leadership. They said, this is a big systemic problem. What do we have at our disposal to solve big systemic problems? Isn't that what government's for? Right, well, we want government to do something about it. Almost immediately, there comes but we don't think they're going to. So that greater concern actually went side by side with growing levels of cynicism in the ability of us to take action collectively. What happened then was a loss of trust and confidence in government. Now, loss of trust in government is a much wider trend anyway, but in this particular study, we saw this very, very, very specifically. And this is what my colleagues decided to call reflexive impotence. This is the horse and cart bit, right? This is saying, well, look, we know government needs to do stuff. We don't trust that they will, so we're just going to do what we can do. And when we asked people how they could have most impact as individuals, we said, how about writing to your MP, or how about protest? How about sort of what we might label citizen-type actions rather than consumer actions? And actually, those suggestions bombed. People didn't want to do that because of this loss of trust and confidence. Hence the retreat into those very sort of individualistic responses. So it was really interesting for us to really unpick and work out people's attitudes here and see how those changed as their concern about climate grew. And in a sense, why we do this sort of process is to allow, through these processes, you can get it's a bit of a laboratory, and that you can get an idea what might happen if a government was to have this conversation with 70 million people, rather than, in this case, the 40-person panel that we had. And we started thinking, well, if this is a cycle, could we try and undo it? If this is a vicious circle, could we turn it into a virtuous circle? And I think that we can. I think that what this points to is that this isn't a fundamental, we don't want to do anything about climate change. This is we don't believe that we can put our weight behind collective solutions and that the government will step up to the plate. Now, I see some possibilities there. I see the possibility of building climate citizenship, of developing that social mandate. You might want to say, going back to one of the very original ideas of political thinking, you think of people like Hobbes and Rousseau in their very, very different ways, who put forward some kind of social contract idea. You might want to say that we need a better social contract for climate change. So I'm going to show you through another circle in a moment what that social contract might look like and how we can build public support. But before I do that, I want to have two diversions, because what I've been doing so far is to generalize massively about everyone as if we're all the same, and of course we're not. So I mentioned already Climate Assembly UK, which is the process that I was involved with government. If we are going to build this social mandate, then it's absolutely critical that we have this open and honest conversation with people. And this is what we managed to do through Climate Assembly UK, resulting in that report, The Path to Net Zero, which is on the Climate Assembly UK website. And one of the critical things about this kind of process, and with that circle I showed you, is that it focuses on the process of view formation as a social process and not an individual process. Those of you familiar with economic theory will know about the idea of revealed preferences, that we all have our preferences, but that through the process of the market, those preferences are revealed. We can show our preferences through what we choose to buy or sell. Many political theorists would say that the process of view formation is itself very important, that people don't have preset views. There's a sense of sort of I will if you will. And that, for me, is how you start to try and turn that circle around. So the question that we ask in this sort of process is, under what conditions could we harness that concern and build the social mandate for climate action? There's a film about Climate Assembly UK. It's on iPlayer. I'm only in it for about 3 words because it was all about the people. And I would really urge you to watch it if you want to follow up. I would warn you, it is a tearjerker. But it's incredible to see the dedication that these people had. So, what would this circle look like if it went the other way? It would look something like this. So the first two are as before. We have a greater understanding of the climate crisis. Imagine if this was to happen to 70 million rather than just the 100 in that room. And that would lead to greater concern about climate. Concern's already high, but it would lead to a focused concern on that. So if you're a political leader serious about democracy and climate, what could you then do? Well, the first thing would be to have government leadership, for a politician to stand up and say, you might call this a social contract, I will if you will. I am willing to lead on climate because I know that there's support for it. You can then, once you do that, you start to build trust and confidence. You also create the environment, by which I mean cultural space, physical environment, physical infrastructure, which allow people to make the right choices. They then look at this in terms of individual and collective action. The more normal climate action becomes, whether that's different transport choices, whether that's different dietary choices, different ways of structuring society to reduce emissions, through those policies, they become quite demonstrative policies. You get greater understanding of climate action, and this circle goes round and again. So that's the beginnings of the model. But I said I had 2 diversions. The first is that we're not all the same. So this is from some work that you're actually the first people to, and this graph doesn't look exciting, but it will be once I explain it. You're the first people to see it because we worked on this over the past few weeks. We did some work on the levels of support for measures to restrict advertising. So this is specific to advertising, but I think it paints a pretty good picture of what people think about government policies generally. And again, a first, and this isn't me, this was my colleague, actually used AI techniques to sort the data on this. The data came from a citizens panel, similar to the ones I've been describing, but he basically chucked the data into a data processing link which said, what are the most natural clusters to come out of this data? What clusters best explain people's support for measures to restrict advertising? And it is actually, the AI thing is important because it wasn't us as researchers imposing our views. It was, we literally threw the data in and said, what clusters come out? And you'll see that 5 clusters came out. And this is actually, the other, in terms of triangulating this research, it's very consistent with polling and other data, which looks at how the different socioeconomic demographics and different levels of support for climate policy. Sorry, I said this was from a citizens panel. It was a citizens panel of 30 people and also a poll of 2,000, which is why we can talk about percentages. It's 2,000 people in this sample as a whole, so we can actually split it out. So to look at these 5 groups, well, this one here are the people who object to the policy, and they pretty much objected to everything that people suggested that they did on climate. Now, that's not a surprise. That correlates. My guess would be that most, although we didn't ask them, my guess would be that most of these people have questions either about climate science or about the role of government. There's some interesting demographics about this as well, which I can go into. But then at the other end, so that's about 10%, at the other end you have about a quarter who pretty much would say yes to anything with a climate label on it. Not everything, but they say, okay, right, if that's something you want to do for the climate, fine, I'm behind it. My guess is that most of the people that I do talks to would be in here, or at least sort of maybe with a few conditions. But, that's a pretty solid demographic there. And, that's 25%. That's not bad. But it's these 3 in the middle which are fascinating. We might call these the conditional supporters. They're the people that say, yep, I know we need to do stuff about climate, and I do back it, but, or I do back it if. And so roughly around 20-25% in each of those 3. But imagine that you stacked the neutrals, the moderates, and the support or accept ban, which I'll explain. Imagine if you stack that up, and you'd be getting to, 60-70% of people in the support with conditions box. And I think that's really, really crucial, because to be completely frank about it, you're never going to convince these people, and these are your absolute core supporters. They're the kind of people who would in political terms, so this kind of work is done much more for political work than for policy work. These people are your absolute, safe voters. You'll always have their support. You shouldn't take them for granted, but you can afford to take risks with them. These 3 groups in the middle, it's all to play for. So what might influence those groups in the middle? This research didn't say this, but the more deliberative panels showed that fairness and conceptions of fairness are absolutely critical here. Whether or not people perceive a policy to be fair. There's geographical aspects to it, like whether people think it would work for the place that they're in, which is interesting because climate policy tends to be very top-down, non-place specific. And then also people's views on government intervention generally. And that's why you get a difference between the proposal to ban advertising of high-carbon products and services and other proposals like labelling systems that we put before them. A big chunk supported everything except the ban. And from our qualitative data, we think that group were opposed to essentially sort of top-down government intervention. They would support labelling, which promotes choice, but they wouldn't support a ban. So that, again, that's a really interesting socio-economic grouping. So the bottom line for this is that people are not all the same, that you can actually centre in on those 3 central points, and you have to lean into that conditionality. You have to talk about how would policies work for the people in their conditions that they're in. So that's one diversion. The second diversion is that it's really important, if you're talking about democracy, not just to talk about how to give people a louder voice, but ask who has the loudest voice in the current system. And it is absolutely proven through research, not by me, but by other scholars, that the people who have the loudest voice tend to be the richer corporations, and they tend to be people who have a strong stake in the high-carbon status quo, and this affects democracy. We know it from lobbying, we know it from the press, we know it from how the political system operates. It's absolutely obvious in the US, it happens here as well, but it's more subtle. And what these interests do is to use what William Lamb and colleagues have called discourses of climate delay. So 20 years ago, and you'll be familiar with this, what those organised voices did was to downplay the science, and we have it on evidence that companies like Exxon and Shell absolutely played down the severity and the certainty of climate science. That worked for a couple of decades, longer even, 3 or 4, depending on how far back you look in their archives. But it doesn't wash anymore. It's too obvious that climate change is happening. And so there was this tactical switch to discourses of climate delay rather than climate denial. And these are all examples of climate delay. The idea that we shouldn't do anything because China's a bigger economy and they need to get their act together first. A kind of policy perfectionism that you should just do a global carbon tax and there's no point in doing anything until you have that. A new one, which I find very concerning, is the idea that we're all doomed. There's no point in doing anything. We may as well sort of party on. There's one that's used quite a lot as well, that whatever policy they're talking about hits poorest people hardest. And the difficulty with all of those is I look at all of those and I think, yeah, there's an element of truth there. You know, I would, and I spend a lot of my time making sure that the kinds of policies that government proposes do not hit poor people the hardest. In fact, you're looking for policies that actually hit the social sweet spot as well as the carbon sweet spot. So there's, we need carbon removal technologies to meet our emissions targets. So, there are some technologies that are really promising. But the trouble with all these is they have an element of truth in them, but there's a kind of absolutism to the discourses of climate delay that, we shouldn't do anything because of China, or we shouldn't do anything because a new technology will sweep in. And they're used incredibly effectively by these lobbies to essentially counter democracy. So this could have been a talk on its own, but I just wanted to add the idea of discourses of climate delay because it's the other side of democracy, if you like. It's what's not working in current democracy. And this, I'd be interested if... Has anyone seen... Hands up if you've seen the Posh and Beck's meme. Yeah, okay, a few of you. So there was, on this documentary about the Beckhams, basically Victoria was saying, my family was working class. And to which David replied, be honest. And she said, no. We used to drive an old car. And he said, be honest. And eventually she said, okay, it was a Mercedes. We weren't working class. And he said, thank you. And so this meme took over the world. And the version that I found most amusing was the phrase, we'll need oil and gas for decades. Posh is saying it there. And then she says, we'll need... That didn't cut the mustard. So then she said, we'll need some oil and gas for decades. And she finally said, I want to sell oil and gas for decades. So have a look out for that meme. You can tell that I have young adult children. But the last thing I wanted to leave you with is my own manifesto for climate citizenship. Based on everything I've said today, what would I be saying to Ed Miliband if he was in the audience? In fact, I have said this to Ed Miliband. The first thing, and remember that circle, the first thing is to have an absolutely honest acknowledgement of the challenge. To say, this is big and difficult, and dealing with it is going to be a challenge, and will it be experimenting at times? We'll get things wrong, but we're in this together. Secondly, to assume that people will support, because the data tells us that, right? The data tells us that we want to act ourselves, and we want government to lead the way. We want government to make it possible for us to do what we need to do. So work with the assumption that people will support climate action. Don't just rely on that assumption. Make sure you appeal to, remember those 3 middle bars, make sure you appeal to the conditional supporters. I think it's really, really important to strengthen the citizen voice. That's what we were doing with Climate Assembly UK. Climate Assembly UK was run by Parliament, and the government at the time, that was Boris Johnson's government, absolutely ignored it. And I've had some of the most bruising conversations of my career with government advisors who just said, we are not listening to you. So I would argue, and we're putting this proposal to the new government, that there needs to be a permanent People's Assembly, Citizens' Assembly on climate that brings those representative voices to bear on climate policy, alongside the Climate Change Committee and the Climate Change Act, which you'll probably know about. On the point around high carbon economic interests, we absolutely need to correct for incumbency. I'm not actually sure that correction is the right word. We need to be brutally aware of incumbency, and we need to talk openly about power in the system and how that aligns with economic interests, and how that, if left unchecked, is a brake on progress. That's an area that, as a research group, we feel we need to go into, because we've done all we can to amplify citizens' voices, and sometimes that isn't enough. And so it's an area that we're going into. I feel that I can do that, frankly, towards the middle end of my research career. I couldn't have done that 20 years ago, maybe because it was a different environment, but also because it does label you. You know, you're saying difficult things to people in power, and that's problematic, and that's why there hasn't been enough of a focus on that. I think it's really essential to get a geographical dimension to this. As I said, climate policy is very top-down, so I would absolutely focus it on local areas, give local people the power, again, through this kind of democratic forum to help you decide. We talk about citizens as co-designers. So the idea that, especially if it's a policy that's going to hit your everyday life, like changes to transport, changes to food and so on, we have lived experience of this as people that isn't tapped into nearly properly enough. We did some research to show that people are sort of almost non-existent in policy analysis, in policy documents on climate, whereas for health, it's sort of second nature to ask people their experiences of health or social care needs. That doesn't happen for climate, it needs to. And the last thing is to develop what I might call, what we like to call symbolic policies, policies which really tell a story of what needs to happen. So things like community-owned wind power, and this picture is the UK's first community-owned wind power. I love this project. It's just down the road from me in Cumbria, just outside Ulverston. That's Bay Wind, and it was the first time that a community organisation had owned wind turbines in the UK. That's become more common, but not nearly as common as it should be. So I would say, if you're listening, Keir Starmer, this would be how you could really take politicians with you on climate, how you could actually develop a manifesto for climate citizenship and ambitious climate action. But given the work I do, I don't want to have the last word. So I'm going to give the last word to the participants at Climate Assembly UK, and I'm going to play the trailer, but there is a full hour online if you're interested, and I will leave the last word with them.
I'm Amanda from Kent, and I'm 27.
So this weekend is going to be about introducing you to climate change in a thorough way.
It was really exciting. To be told I was selected just seemed like a very rare opportunity.
Initially, I wasn't sure what it would be like, because I hadn't done anything like that before.
Perfectly honest with you, I didn't have a clue what zero carbon was.
I didn't know enough about climate change. I was open to information.
There were so many different perspectives and opinions. So many people of different ethnicity, different ages.
It was so nice to see, the representation of the UK.
The fact that you've given up time to come here and take this seriously is of the greatest importance.
It felt like the community kind of working together towards a problem that the whole world needs to face, to be fair.
Obviously at the moment we're all on lockdown.
Moving on to 3 internet weekends was quite good. We were still investigating things on our own. I'm not saying we're experts now, but we all have opinions.
Everybody's had a taste of this cleaner air. Surely most people would want that for their children and their grandchildren.
Well, if we treat climate change the same way as we're treating coronavirus, then we can do it.
We all want the government to take heed of our recommendations.
They need to act on it, but also to act on it fast. So it's not about saying, okay, we just keep deliberating over it over the next 1 year, 2 years.
They are by law bound to try to get to this target.
It's got to be done in a fair and positive way.
So if we don't act now, we're just going to run out of time and there won't be a future for any of us.
And if we can show that we can do it, then perhaps others will follow. I think somebody has to be a leader.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your patience. And you've inundated us with questions. We will do our best, and we have the microphones. One is downstairs when Alex is ready, and there's a microphone upstairs. I'm going to start off with Graham Smith's question. One of his questions, and it's about you, Becky. Are you a researcher or a political activist?
Well, I'd like to ask why that question's being asked, but I won't. When I was interviewed for my role, I described myself as an activist, and I did that very deliberately, and I thought they might not give me the job because of that. But I did it anyway, because I think the evidence demands an activist stance. Activism in the true sense of rolling your sleeves up and getting on with it. And thank you. I'm very careful as an academic that what I do is based on evidence. And that is the absolute cornerstone of what I do. I'm very happy for that evidence to be used by anyone within the framework of decision making. So our evidence was just quoted by Friends of the Earth, brilliant. If it's used by companies, again, really good. But yeah, we need to get on with it.
Anne's got a question which is quite different, but it might follow on from what you've just said. And she wonders, and this has been asked before, by the way, if you remember Peter Hain coming. What do you think of Just Stop Oil fanatics? She calls them fanatics. What do you think of the Just Stop Oil activists?
I think that protest has a really, really important part in the democratic process. And I will support the right to protest and go on the record saying I support that, absolutely. I also feel that it's not my role, because I don't study protest, it is not my role to say whether I think people should be breaking the law or not, because that's the only, from my mind, that is the only controversial thing about it, whether you should be breaking the law in order to change the law. Now, I don't break the law because I work within those frameworks. I advise government, I use publicly funded, I use taxpayers' money to fund my research, and I don't think that I could do that credibly if I broke the law. So that's my decision. but it is not up to me to police what other people do. And I understand how you might look at what's happening on climate, look at the intransigence of governments and some governments and some companies, and why you might get pretty desperate about it and be willing to take what people might regard as desperate measures. But I don't feel like I'm able to judge that. I'm sorry if that's a cop-out answer, but I've thought about this a lot, and that's the position I've come to.
No, that's a great answer. We've got another question about activism. Do you consider a rise in sea level globally to be something that would galvanize people into taking action? I mean, can you see that some of these physical events are going to actually work in favour of the arguments that you're putting forward? And Graham Daly's got a question, because we had Guy, I expect you know Guy Evans, and she came along with her view that climate change, under certain assumptions of degrees of temperature rise, would create huge migrations. She's talking about billions of people over the next 50 years, thereby threatening democracy. So can you see these hers is an extreme vision, long term, and here's a question about sea level rises. I don't know when those inundations are going to dislocate large numbers of people, but do you see those activities as actually bringing about change?
I've absolutely no doubt that climate impacts, both direct, like sea level rise, and indirect, like changes to migration patterns, which actually the research that so far shows is almost entirely within countries, not between countries, by the way. Those kinds of patterns undoubtedly will affect politics. Will they necessarily galvanise people to have that kind of collective action for climate? I don't know. I saw some research on this the other week, who showed that essentially stresses to the political system can push things either way. And this is the first time I'd seen this research, because it's an under-researched area, and he was saying that if you look at some stresses, like stresses around food prices, that can actually lead to a greater sense of collective action and the need for collective action, or it can get people to sort of retreat into a more defensive space. Personally, I don't want to wait and see, right? The evidence is good enough. We've had enough. You know, members of my family were flooded out during Storm Desmond. No one died in the Lake District in Storm Desmond because we're a really well-developed country. You have a similar climate impact in places in the global south with earth infrastructure, and we're talking about lives lost on a regular basis. And I'm not prepared to wait until that gets even worse.
Can we go back to the earlier question? Because I've just spotted a question from Ian Durdoff. We talked about the Just Stop Oil people. This is a different question from Ian. How effective or otherwise are, and he mentions Just Stop Oil, XR, Extinction Rebellion, and he also mentions Greenpeace, and you could probably add to the list. So I think he's wondering whether they actually are helping the cause that you've been discussing tonight, or the opposite. Would you like to explore that with us?
There was, so my research hasn't looked at this directly, but there was a paper in Nature this week on that very topic, which said that protest of the Just Stop Oil type, so essentially illegal protest, illegal peaceful direct action, increased support from moderate environmental organisations. So it is an effective tactic. Now, you know, you might still not agree with it, but this evidence suggested that it's not true that organisations like Just Stop Oil actually sort of turn people off. They might turn people off that organisation, but they do awaken people's concern about the cause. And I mean, that's just what this evidence suggested.
Let's just explore Anne Bowling's question about whether we choose the bit of the argument that we like. Do people support green solutions, net zero, provided it doesn't cost them?
Yes. But can I have a...
Willis? Go ahead.
have more than one word on that, I would also say that for most of the things that we need to change in order to meet those emissions reductions, prices are already set or at least influenced by government. So, we all know that aviation is the least taxed and most damaging of all transport methods. We know that the food system is basically subsidises meat and dairy. So yes, people will do things that make sense for their pocket, but it's totally in the gift of governments to change those costs, and often in ways that are quite systemic and not, the thing that people always throw their hands up in horror about is the idea of a meat tax. You don't have to do it sort of directly downstream, but if you look at the way that the food system has been sort of systematically subsidised in the wrong direction, you can begin to see the points of intervention around price.
We can't be a Citizens Advice Bureau or a customer service helpline, but it's quite a variety of questions. Becky, how can I do X, Y, and Z to make the planet better? And I'll just give you the flavour, and then just give us, perhaps you can give a general guideline. Alison, how can I offset a flight? Jill, I need a new boiler. How do I find out what to replace it with for the benefit of the planet? Andrew Hornsby, can solar panels on good agricultural land ever be justified? And as another one from Sandra and co, a group of them, what practical steps can individuals take to make a significant impact? Is it possible to answer the questions at the level of the individual?
Offsetting flights, don't offset, or at least don't call it offsetting. My advice to my friends is the point around offsetting is it's what the airlines want you to do because they don't want to, they pretend that you can make the carbon costs go away through offsetting. That's not true. We can remove about through carbon removal about 10% max of our emissions in the UK. So we shouldn't use the term offsetting. Carbon removal I'm all in favour of, but not swapping one for the other. So I would say don't go through the airline's offset system. Find out how much they want you to pay, double it, and pay it to a climate organisation that best fits your values. Boiler, you need a heat pump. Heat pumps work in less well-insulated houses now. I looked around a showroom for my own house last week. You can have £7,500 off at the moment from the government. Solar panels on good agricultural land, I would always go rooftops first. Again, I was talking about how the price incentive works at the moment. It's just easier to shove them up on farmland. That shouldn't be the case. I'm not saying it's a blanket no to solar farms, but land is incredibly scarce in this country and globally. So I think that's a debatable. Practical steps. I'm sorry to say this, it's the last chapter in my book. But how to be a good...
still there? They may be.
Yeah. How to be a good climate citizen. I would say think of citizen actions as well as consumer actions. Go and see your MP. Vanishingly few people do. Go and see your MP. Say that you're concerned about climate. If you feel awkward doing that, good, because that's who the MPs want to hear from, not the usual suspects. Think about joining an organisation. If you do actions yourself as a consumer, talk about them. Just like not in a judgmental way. Just say, I decided to take the train and this is why. And just see how that lands with people.
We've got several questions about population, and it's sort of, it's probably not in your area, and we've had people speaking about this before, but Gordon Woodcock wonders whether there'd be a climate crisis if there wasn't an increase of 100 million of millions in the population, and we've had someone else wondering whether there should be efforts to reduce the population. The means were not specified.
So I would, yes, of course, the fewer of us there are, the lower carbon emissions on average. So from that point of view, is there a relationship between people and climate change? Absolutely, there is. However, I would put it firmly in the discourses of delay box, in that, firstly, our carbon footprint, which at last look, I think it's going down, but I think it's about 5 tonnes a person compared to 0.2 in Bangladesh. So that's, you know, do the maths on that. And also, you know, good population policies, we should have them anyway. It's a both and. And what are the best population policies? They are education for women and girls. They are really good primary health care. They are all things we should be encouraging. So yes, I'm all for population policies, but actually not for climate reasons.
Children. You didn't mention children, says Chris Nibs. Do you think they have a role to play in he said in formulating policy?
Yeah.
You'd like to expand on that?
When the school strikes were happening, and they only stopped because of COVID, and it was really sad. I was invited into my local secondary schools to talk to some of the young strikers who'd been inspired by Greta Thunberg to take to the streets in the Fridays for Future, and it was amazing to see their to see their dedication. And what really upset me was that the way the schools were handling that, they were trying, for the best intentions, they were trying to harness that enthusiasm and saying, let's set up an eco club and see what we can do in school. Now, you know, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but what these children were saying and what Greta Thunberg was saying is, you know, this is my future at stake. The stakes are really high. And frankly, an eco club at school ain't going to cut it. And, you know, I've got now very young adult children, and you can see them looking out and seeing what's happening and just wondering what's going on. And we need to bottle that naivety, actually, because it's partly because we're cynical that we sit back and say, well, you know, that'll never happen. And you need a whole load of people going, this can happen because this has to happen. And I think that's much more likely to come from younger people. My only caveat is I'm really opposed to people saying, oh, we've messed it up, but the younger ones will solve it, because they have no power in this. So those of us who do have the power need to stand up and support them. Excuse me. Hang on.
I'm going to focus on some of the citizen or local questions now. Joe Sexton wonders about are repair cafes and farmers. Are you familiar with the repair cafes? Yes. And everyone know? No. Yes. Right. And farmers markets, of course. She wonders asks whether they're a waste of time.
No. They're not a waste of time. So one of the main things we need to do to cut carbon emissions is to look really seriously at the circular economy. So essentially, carbon emissions embedded in the stuff that we buy, and we're working on a citizens panel at the moment on that. And things like repair cafes and also a right to repair, where you have to support people who want to repair things, are absolutely part of the solution. Same with farmers markets. My one caveat about farmers markets is that if you look at the stats on emissions from food, the transport of that food, i.e. whether it's local or not, is insignificant compared to what that food is. So basically, around food, it is talking about reducing meat and dairy. That is by far the biggest impact. Combining that with local food is great, but, you know, to be crude about it, buying local beef is not better than buying imported pulses.
Yes, we'll take that question now on the microphone. And if there's anyone upstairs who would like the microphone, show your hand so Zena can see you.
Hi, my question, do you think that the distrust in the government comes down to local level as well as national? For example, national agencies such as the Environment Agency don't successfully tackle big businesses such as Willis Quarry.
Such as, what's the quarry?
Such as?
Willis Quarry, it's a local quarry here. It's been brought to MP by Aaron Bell quite significantly whilst he was the local MP. So I'm just wondering, the Environment Agency have been already admitted fault for not dealing with that business.
Yeah, so I don't know about that case locally, I'm sorry, but I do understand people's cynicism in the political process at local level as well as at national. The case that I've been very involved in locally is the proposal for a new coal mine in West Cumbria. And, the local council has approved that, I think, 3 or 4 times, and it's finally been overturned in the High Court. The issue there is that, frankly, that was a planning issue. That was a planning committee decided that. The trouble is that climate policy is made at national level. There's almost no, well, no, not almost no. There's very little that local areas can do. They have very little control over the money spent. They have very little control over the policies. So they have very little control over local climate strategies. They can write them, but whether or not they get to deliver them is massively dependent on what happens at a national level. So I think that one of the most obvious things you can do is to devolve both the responsibility and also the power and the finances to local areas. I think that's quite a bold move. You'd have to be brave to do it, but I think it would be a really good way of improving democracy.
I'm going to move on to national and international political stuff in a minute, but let's stick with citizens and citizens' assemblies, because we've got a couple of interesting questions. There's one from Ian. It's going to be essential when getting all citizens involved that it's perceived to be carried out equally across the country, north and south, rural and urban. And so Ian wonders whether that can be achieved. So just hang on to that thought. Sean King, quite differently, how do we convince politicians to support citizens' assemblies when they could be seen as competitors to Parliament?
I'll start with the second one, because that's a question I get asked a lot by politicians. And not everyone agrees with me on this, but my position is that in a representative democracy, the buck stops with elected politicians. So, we don't have a direct democracy. It's very different, Athenian marketplace style. By the way, in Athens, neither women nor slaves got the vote. So we don't have that kind of marketplace direct democracy. We're 70 million people. You've got to have representatives. So I'm all in favour of representative democracy. What things like citizens' assemblies do is allow you to do that representative democracy better. So putting a cross on a slip of paper and chucking it in a box every 5 years is the crudest way of expressing your opinions, right? So in a working democracy, there are lots of other ways that the citizen voice is heard through a well-functioning media, obviously through the sort of conversations that people have formally and informally with politicians and with the government. But I think you could formalise that a bit more through a lot more use of deliberative processes like citizens' assemblies. I don't think the findings should be legally binding, and not all democracy scholars agree with me on that, but I think that the buck has to stop with the politicians. In terms of the rural-urban thing, that's really interesting. A colleague in my team, Rachel Coxgoon, looks at this explicitly. She looks at climate policy impacts on rural areas, and she thinks they're pretty hard done by. We need to get a good geographic spread of views into policies, and for various reasons, climate policies tend to have benefited people in cities around insulation and the housing stock, around transport and shifts away from car use. They all, for various reasons to do with policy design, have tended to work best for people in cities. And she thinks that there's going to be growing opposition from rural areas, which I find really, really interesting. When we do citizens' panels and so on, we make sure we have a representative rural-urban split. We also, by the way, make sure that we have representative political worldviews because, not just because we think it's really important to get a sort of spread of worldviews in our processes, and we know essentially that left-wing people are more likely to self-select for these processes, and people to the right of centre are less likely to put themselves forward for these processes. So you have to correct for that in the final sample, and we think that's really important. It's our research that sort of discovered that sort of political bias, if you like, in the belief in these processes.
I'd like to move now on to towards closer to the politicians, and we've got quite a few questions that are asking you to, I think, mark the recent governments out of 10, and let's sort of see how we can do that. So I'll explore the question. So Tony MacDonald, you intimated you had some lack of empathy from our previous government. What about the present lot is where he puts it. And I discussed that with him in the interval, and he agrees that it'd be quite interesting if you don't just look at the ones who just lost the election, but looked at, track back, because there have been several administrations under different prime ministers. So you might have a view that sort of goes over the last 10 or more years as to how well or how badly they did, and then compare what he calls the present lot with that. And then, so Gordon Gunn, the previous government disregarded your research results. Is there hope that the new government will take notice? And Julie, what happened to the change we were promised at the last election, particularly climate related? I'm astounded by the, is it CCS idea? So let's just, so would you like to?
I'm going to roll those together, but I'm going to end with CCS because I think that's fascinating. CCS is carbon capture and storage. I hate acronyms. So I will support any. I will support any democratically elected government who is trying to implement a climate strategy. I will tell them we have targets set in law through the Climate Change Act, and it's my job, along with lots of other people's jobs, to tell government how to meet them. So I will advise governments of any colour. I won't comment on other policy areas because climate is my specialism, except obviously where it overlaps. So generally doing climate policy as a part of social policy makes sense, right? As a result, I tend to talk about fairness rather than justice or equity. And I think you'll find within citizens' panels, there are some people who are like completely behind a sort of justice framing, others aren't, and there's a political difference. So I think you have to have some sort of neutrality about the way you talk about social issues. So will I mark recent governments? Yes, I will. I spent a long time working with the coalition. I mean, I started work. You don't want me to do the whole history, Bill, but I started working on this just as Tony Blair got elected. That was interesting. I worked with the coalition, and I worked with successive Conservative administrations. I would say they were all trying in various ways, but there was a big change about, 2.5 years ago now. At the time of the Liz Truss mini-budget, me and my research colleagues just decided that this government was not committed to the climate change targets in principle, and they weren't really working on climate, and they were actually I forgot my words, they were not supportive of citizen engagement. And so we didn't really engage politically anymore. We still talk to civil servants. They really wanted to talk to us, but we didn't try to persuade politicians who we thought were unpersuadable. Has that changed? Yes, it has. Interestingly, Ed Miliband in his opening speech talked about citizens, not consumers. That might sound like a bit of a linguistic point, but to me it's really important. We are citizens as well as consumers. We do both things. They have a net zero mission. It's one of their 5 driving missions across government. They are actively talking to people, including us, about how to achieve that mission. So there does feel like a bit of re-energizing, but I will hold them to exactly the same standards as the rest. And those standards are: is it enough to meet our Paris commitments and our commitments under our legally binding commitments under the Climate Change Act? So CCS, I think it's the wrong policy to lead on. I think carbon removal is absolutely necessary, but CCS is like big and technical and like miles away from people's lives. One thing the Labour government actually is really keen to focus on through Great British Energy, which is funding the carbon capture, is actually community-owned renewables. And I think that is a much better policy to lead on and get the media shouting about, because it connects to people. They can understand why these wind farms should be owned by at least in part by the people who live near to them. So for me, CCS is absolutely the wrong policy to lead on.
We're now going to get to the nub of the British political party system, because I've got 4 people with broadly the same question. We're going to read them out. Dick Tyndall, if there's so much concern about climate, why don't more people vote for the Greens? John Kelly. Our democratic system does not work. Is that the way that encourages voters to support the Green Party? How do we get climate change to be the number one priority for all? Adrian Cartwright. If there's so much support for green issues, why don't we see more support for the Green Party? And Sally Richardson says she's voted for the Green Party several times, but it never gets anywhere. How do we show our support?
Okay, so in terms of our democratic system, it doesn't, obviously, I mean, you know, it's just fact that it doesn't work well for the Green Party. We know that because we can look across different electoral systems and see electoral systems under which parties like the Green Party you know, just have more electoral success, and we particularly see their role in coalitions in Scandinavia, for example. It's hard, like, it's a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because while we know that your vote isn't going to go anywhere by voting Green, fewer people will vote Green, which is why it was really interesting to see the upswell at the last election and 4 Greens elected, which was sort of, I think, beyond the wildest dreams of the Green Party themselves. So, I mean, personally, I would support proportional representation. That's just my personal view. We haven't done the research on that, whether that would result in better climate outcomes, which is what you would need to do. What I would say about the Green Party, and this isn't a judgment, this is a description, is that the Green Party position themselves as a party of environmental protection, should we say, and social justice. Now, that will appeal to people who have quite what you might conventionally describe as a sort of left view of social justice. Again, you know, no judgment there, just a description, and they're open about that. If you look at their social policies, they're quite interventionist. They are, you know, quite into ideas of equity and justice. That's great. But we know that there are plenty of people who are concerned about climate, want solutions to climate, and might not sign up for the whole Green Party agenda. So I'm asking, where's the offer for those people? And I looked to the Tories for that, and I didn't see it forthcoming. I haven't seen. There were aspects within the Tory party and the Conservative Environment Network, which is a really useful and influential caucus within the Conservative Party, but I haven't seen Conservative leaders in recent days anyway really leaning into the fact that there are plenty of Conservative voters who would support strong climate action, which doesn't necessarily have the same sort of political baggage as some of the Green Party offers.
Just an intervention. Alex, would you mind looking outside for me to find out if Nantwich Bookshop are still with us, and give me the thumbs up if that's the case. Just before we get on to international stuff, which I'm keen to get on to, just a very quick word, if you don't mind, about corporate. There are a couple of questions. So expressed in this way, Sid Goodwin, when it comes to action, will vested interest prevail, and will our increasing selfishness not help? And Jeff Elliott, persuading state actors may be possible, but how do we persuade the corporate actors? And we've had people here, of course, who have been trying to work with corporates, and then you probably have as well. Have you got what's your thought in 2024 about their persuadability to really, really get on board?
I mean, I think, so in terms of corporate interests within the political system, I think it needs a really strong spotlight, and we need to have a very open conversation about the role of power and money in politics. Interestingly, we've started to do that around water companies, and I think it's really interesting that those issues are out in the open now. How you know, and it's not my specialism, but it's really interesting to see as an observer how the sort of successive scandals around Thames Water and so on have shone a spotlight on the corporate activities of those companies. I'm amazed that the oil majors can still make the case that they are part of the solution. So, you know, I worked with BP, not for. I worked for an organisation that was funded in part by BP 20 years ago, when I thought they could justifiably claim that they could be part of the solution. They were investing heavily in renewables. It was sort of early days. We were willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. If you look at their actions and other actions since, and I haven't got time to document this, but they've had their chance. It's very clear from the science that we cannot dig any more oil and gas out of the ground through new sites of extraction, and the new sites of extraction is really important. We cannot open any new sites of extraction and stay within carbon targets. That's not an opinion, that's maths. Therefore, any company that's saying we need new sites of extraction is going against the science, and that's just the facts of it. These are the facts that I repeated time and time again over the Cumbrian coal mine on the BBC. Like, we can't even agree that basic fact. As long as companies aren't agreeing with that, I don't think that we should give them our support. Intrinsic selfishness, I just don't believe that. I've spent, as I showed you, my research is about sitting in rooms with representative groups of people who are, of course, preoccupied, aren't we all, by their own lives, by their own bank balances, by the lives of their own children, by whatever's important to them, be that, sport or art or whatever. So, they're not obviously like waking up every morning and saying, how can I, do the right thing on climate, because they're living busy lives. And by the way, the poorer you are, the more effort it is just to lead your life. But what you see in these processes is an incredible, actually, generosity of spirit and, wanting to come together and do things collectively. And people are, honestly, they are so pleased to be asked to be part of these processes. The number one question we get is, how can we continue? And also, how can we make sure that governments are listening to us? And so you see this incredible public spiritedness in a randomly selected group of people, and I hang on to that. That's what keeps me doing this work.
We're getting short of time, but I want to go international in 4 areas. This one's a quickie, very straightforward. Amongst many of us in the audience, I'm sure, I'm wondering why 54 Commonwealth heads and their entourages are travelling to Samoa rather than meeting online. Quick comment on that?
Okay.
There might be a knighthood at stake or something. It's up to you.
I'd love to say I'd already turned one of those down. I think that there should be, the problem with aviation in particular is that there is very little public debate about the impact of aviation. Bill and I had this conversation earlier. I suspect that one of the reasons that it is the area that governments are most blind to is because most decision makers in business or in government fly a lot, and they don't stop to think that, most of the world has never got on a plane and never will. 50% of people in our own country in the UK don't fly, mainly because they can't afford to. So I absolutely think that we should, at the very least, and this is in terms of carbon budgets, we need to stop the expansion of aviation. We're working to 70% increase in aviation. Those are the government scenarios. That seems crazy to me when you think it's the least fair of all areas. But having said that, I don't actually have a problem with people flying to international meetings. I think that people eyeballing each other, like if we were restricting aviation, I think I would still allow people to do diplomacy.
Right, so autocracy is the thread through some of these questions. Rod Mitchell, Jeff Tucker, and to an extent Dave Burrows. So given that your argument, this is Rod, thinks your presentation, your argument was based on democracy, and given that the majority of the world's population doesn't enjoy democracy, where next is how he puts it. Similarly from Jeff Tucker, how do you engage with the liberal democracies and autocracies and the global south, developing countries for that matter, to get change. And David Burrows sees it slightly different, not so much autocratic, more about pointless making all this effort when there are huge countries like Russia, India and China which are burning coal ad nauseum. You'll have heard those questions before, but would you like just to give us a quick perspective, and then we'll get on to the final two.
Sure. So autocracies are worse for the climate than democracies. There's pretty good evidence on that. There's an organisation that I advise called the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, and they've commissioned reports that do the rankings. Democracies are better, mostly because they have greater transparency and less corruption. So they're basically better at policy making. It's relative. Being a democracy doesn't make you good at climate necessarily, as we know to our cost. Some people say that, and James Lovelock, the climate scientist, said that climate change is such a serious issue we should put democracy on hold. Well, there's no empirical evidence that autocracies do better. And I would suggest that the autocratic alternative is not some kind of bloodless coup by enlightened scientists who will somehow steer the world the way we want. I think it's a lot darker and messier than that, and we're seeing that in Russia, potentially in the US. And that kind of autocracy is emphatically not good for the climate or people. So I don't buy into this sort of benign dictatorship view at all. In terms of why should we act when Russia and India and China aren't? Well, I mean, the simple reason is we have more control over what we do than what Russia, India and China do. Climate works best when we're cooperating globally. We need to be a model for that cooperation. We need to be a model domestically and internationally. So, we need to do what we can, and imagine the message it would send if we were like, no, we're not doing this because no one else is, so why should we? Honestly, one of my proudest moments around the coal mine stuff that I was talking about was when I got the government's previous special envoy for climate change, John Ashton, to give evidence to the public inquiry about. For this public inquiry, I didn't give evidence. I just got a whole load of people more expert than me up to the front. And John Ashton just said that it's a travesty of diplomacy that the UK is opening a coal mine because it sends completely the wrong signals globally. We can and should be an example of climate diplomacy.
The DT question, you referred to him indirectly in your talk. So Manny J. Clayton. Donald Trump has never acknowledged climate change as far as I'm aware. How worried should we be if he is elected? And so Zena asked the same question. How do you think US policy towards climate would change if Donald Trump were elected?
So I've talked about delineating my expertise, and I'm emphatically not an expert on US politics. I mean, I don't think it would be a surprise to say that I would be really, really worried about a Donald Trump presidency because of the diplomatic implications of that. I think he said he would withdraw from the Paris Agreement, and he would decimate the institutions and the policies that the US relies on in the climate sphere. Having said that, what we saw last time was, remember, it's a very federal system compared to ours, and we saw states stepping up to the mark. California is as big an economy as the UK, I think, and it does its own sweet thing. And we've actually in the past picked some really good some of the original legislation around vehicle emissions came from California, and we imported it here. And so you can rely on obviously not all, but certain states just to carry on doing their own sweet thing and pretty much ignoring what's happening at federal level. And conversely, you've seen president. So what Barack Obama did was to try and sometimes fail to get recalcitrant states covered by federal legislation, which is actually much harder in the US. In this country, we have a much more centralized system. So, the national government has more control than over our policies than the US president does over the actual legislation governing things like transport and energy and so on within individual states. So that would be my ray of hope.
We've got to finish off with a series of questions about, they relate to the United Nations, but in your final remarks you might be able to tell us whether you think that organisation can make a difference in this area. And we've got Alistair Duncan mentioning the Climate Change Committee's, it's published its latest report yesterday, and the world's not going to achieve its the 1.5 degree temperature rise. So what happens if we fail? And he wonders what the tipping point is. Linda Sherwood, UN said, we're close to the tipping point when 2 degrees will be inevitable. How can citizen action make any difference to that? Stephen Booth, crunch time's arrived. UN says time for climate delays has run out. So he wonders whether a warning of, he's quoting 3.1 degrees global warming. He wonders if that is a surprise. And Dave just wonders whether world leadership in climate is just sort of fiddling while Rome burns, while we're launching rockets into space, consuming in pursuit of things like space tourism and so on, and lots of other things he thinks are destroying the planet. So would you like to sort of comment on the tipping points, what the UN report says, and whether you think the UN can make a scrap of difference in this whole area?
So on the 1.5 threshold, that is a political, not a scientific limit. The science says the lower the temperature rise, the better, basically. One of the reasons, having said that, one of the reasons, and this comes out clearly in the original report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, the reason that there was coalescing around the 1.5 rather than 2 degrees at Paris was that the science suggests that it reduces the likelihood of what are popularly called tipping points, which climate scientists tell me I should use the term threshold event. Those kinds of, once it's happened, you can't undo it, kind of things like melting of ice sheets and permafrost melting and so on. So the reason for 1.5 is to lessen the likelihood of those threshold events, some of which create their own emissions and create a kind of runaway effect. I find it very hard to talk dispassionately about those things. If you think about actually what is involved in terms of impact and suffering to people and the other species that we live on this planet with, I find it very hard to dispassionately discuss 1.5, 2, 3, 4. It just evokes a very human reaction in me, and a very emotional reaction, actually, and I think I really want to acknowledge that. Having said that, I'm going to give the stock answer that every fraction of every degree matters. So it's more and more unlikely that we'll hit 1.5. Okay, 1.6. We don't do that? Okay, 1.7. And that's literally what we're doing. Like the idea that we don't hit 1.5, so we go, you know what? Can't be bothered anymore. I'm just going to bring on 4 degrees. I refer you back to my earlier point. You think of the misery that 4 degrees would impose on us, and I'm back at 1.6, please.
We're all citizens, and we've heard an impassioned talk from Rebecca Willis, and I think she's illuminated, although we've learned a lot about sustainability over the last few years in our meetings here, I think she's opened up another big window for us to understand what we can do and what we can do and get our legislators to do. I'm really grateful for that interesting talk and her forthright answers to some of your usual awkward questions. Yeah, she will be at the book desk, because Nantwich is still there. So, too hot to handle? The democratic challenge of climate change. You've heard a lot about it tonight. Thank you, Rebecca Willis.
Thank you.